All right, story time. We could be all working for any big bank, a tech company, an healthcare company, or whatever. But I'm sure we have all seen that absolutely gorgeous IM slide. You know the one with boxes, colors, arrows, and 15 type of identity accounts. It looks like the Marvel multiverse of identities. And for a second, we are all impressed. But every time I see that slide now, my brain does this little tilt, and I find myself asking the same question every time. Okay, but does any of this actually change what these identities are allowed to do? Welcome back to the Identity Navigator. I am Rohit, and today we are going to hang out in this weird little corner of identity and access management that I am calling the uncanny valley of identity categorization. You know the uncanny valley, right? The feeling when a CGI character or a robot or a picture looks almost human but not quite, and your brain goes, "Nope, something is off." A lot of IM taxonomies give me that same vibe now. They look mature, they sound mature, but when you get close and actually trace that controls, they are unsettling. So, in this episode, I want to unpack a simple and slightly uncomfortable idea. We treat identity as a noun, a static record in a directory. But in any real enterprise, identity behaves like a verb, a continuous state of risk, context, and relationship. And the big mistake I keep seeing is not you don't have the right tools. It's something I call taxonomic depth, where your categories evolve faster than your controls. If that sounds abstract, don't worry. I will tell some stories. We'll walk through some examples, and by the end, you'll probably see pieces of your own environment staring back at you. So let's ground this in reality for a second. Every major report you look at now basically says the same thing. Non human and machine identities massively outnumber human identities in enterprises. In some environments, it's tens to even hundreds to one, which is correct. So, if you picture your employee directory as a room with, say, 1,000 people in it, your actual identity landscape is a stadium packed with machines and a little VIP balcony with the humans. The problem is, a lot of our I am thinking it's still human first. We obsess over employees versus contractors versus vendors versus partners versus intern. While on the machine side, we just keep inventing more and more labels and kind of hopes that governance. So you end up with taxonomies like RPA bot, service account, system account, workload identity, integration user, AI agent. And everyone feels good because, hey, look at all these nuance. Surely, with this many categories, we must be doing some serious governance. But here is where the uncanny valley creeps in. Those labels look sophisticated until you ask, "That's cool, bro. But what's actually different in the control plane for each one of those?" So let's zoom way out for a second and talk philosophy. Most IAM systems treat identity like a record. It's a row in a database, an object in a directory, or a JSON blob in some identity store. First name, last name, employee ID, department, and maybe a couple of flags. Is this a service account? Is this an RPA bot? Is this a workload identity? It's all very noun like. It just sits there. But if you look at how risk actually shows up in real enterprise, identity isn't a row, it's a pattern of behavior over time. Think about it. A human identity that never logs in is boring until one day it logs in from a new country at 3 a.m. and immediately goes for a high value app. A service principal that normally calls one API in one region is fine until it suddenly fans out across regions and start touching data it never needed before. A temporary workload identity that was supposed to be short-lived quietly becomes immortal because nobody wired in rotation or revocation. Those are verbs. That's identities as doing, not just identity as being. And here is the subtle trap. When you think of identity as a noun, adding categories and labels feels like progress. When you think of identity as a verb, categories are only useful if they drive different enforced behavior in your control plane. That gap between how fancy your taxonomy is and how little it changes behavior, that's where taxonomic depth lives. So let's put a name on this. Taxonomic depth is what you accumulate when your identity categories evolve faster than your ability to enforce distinct controls for each categories. So it sounds like this. We distinguish between RPA bots, service accounts, system accounts, workload identities, vendor technical users, and AI agents, and each one has a policy document and a naming convention. And everyone in that meeting feels just a little bit better. You have got a model, you have done governance. Obviously, since you are naming everything, you must know what you are talking about. But here is the litmus test I want you to try the next time you look at your own taxonomy. For each category, can you point to at least one real enforced control difference compared to its neighbor? Now, you cannot cheat. You cannot tell me you cannot point to a bullet in a policy doc, not a promise in a deck, but a real control. That is what you have to point to, like different authentication requirement or different credentials lifetime or rotation rules or different monitoring and alerting thresholds or maybe different joiner mover lever behavior. Now, if for two items or more than two items, if the answer is not really or yeah we meant to, but then that category is basically I am cosplay. You have created complexity without adding control. You have made the diagram better. uh, you have maybe impressed few folks, but you haven't made the environment better. That is taxonomic debt, and that technical debt, the interest compounds. Every new tool you add brings its own labels, which you now need to map into your already complex schema. Every exception gets its own special subtype. Your automation has to branch on 30 different account types that all behaves almost, if not exactly, the same. On the surface, it looks like you have got a level 5 maturity model, and underneath, you are still a level 2 enforcement just with fancier words. No, all of us in identity, we have to ensure that we are not driven by buzzwords, but actual operational maturity. And this is what I'm talking about here. So, let me paint a very real world picture. Imagine an organization decides we are going to get serious about non human identities. So they kick off a working group, they do workshops, and they land on this very sophisticated taxonomy. RPA bots, service accounts, system accounts, workload identities, technical integration user, and each one gets a naming convention, a two-page policy Word document, and a box on the architecture slide. You fast forward 6 months and you ask a very unsexy question. Okay, show me the actual difference in the control plane. And you discover they're all in the same directory or cloud identity store. They all authenticate with long-lived secrets or keys. None of them are enforced to use short-lived tokens. None of them have truly enforced rotation. It's best effort. And monitoring is basically, is the account disabled? Yes or a no. So on paper, this environment looks mature. In reality, if an attacker compromises any one of those labels, the blast radius and the defense posture are basically identical. The labels are different, the outcomes are the same. That gap, where we perform governance but don't materially change risk, that's what I mean by governance theater. We have made better costumes for our identities, but we haven't made better decisions about what they can do. So, now let's talk about the part that gets a little spicy: incentives. IM is not just about technology, it's a giant game of incentives and shortcuts. Every time you create a category that has less friction or fewer prompt or fewer checks, you have basically created a loophole with a marketing name. Here is a pattern I've seen so many times, I could probably whiteboard it in my sleep. You create a service account category that is exempt from MFA, avoids certain conditional access policies, is allowed to be shared by multiple processes, and has strongly recommended rotation, but nothing actually breaks if you don't rotate. It's the justification is always reasonable. It's a machine, Rohit. We can't send an MFA push to a bot, and that's totally fair on the surface. But the moment you do that, you haven't just categorized the machine. You have now created a low friction identity track inside your system. Now imagine you are a dev or an ops engineer under pressure to ship a new integration by Friday. On the right path, you have per user accounts with MFA, approvals, and maybe some awkward UX. On the service account path, you have one credential, no MFA, fewer policy checks, and it just works. Where do you think people route? Over time, what happens is people start using these non human accounts for human interactive tasks. They log into consoles, tools, even desktops using service accounts. You get shared credentials all over the place. And audit trails becomes meaningless because a workload identity is actually a shared human backdoor. The label says machine, the behavior is extremely human. From a game theory perspective, and all of you must have heard, or some of you must have heard me talk about game theory all the time, this is totally predictable. If the easiest way to avoid friction is to pretend to be a machine, humans will absolutely pretend to be machines. Not because they are bad people, because they are rational people trying to get their job done in a system that accidentally rewarded the wrong behavior. So when you look at your categories, don't just ask, is this technically accurate? Ask, what behavior does this label invite? If service accounts quietly translates to MFA free accounts with broad access, you have created an identity honeypot, but for your own teams and eventually for attackers. So let's get a bit nerdy for a second, which comes very natural to me. In IAM, an identity is basically just a pointer. It doesn't contain the human or the machine. It points to a set of credentials or secrets, a set of entitlements, a set of relationships like groups, roles, and attributes, and a history of behavior over time. All our beautiful categories of RPA bots, system accounts, workload identities, those are just metadata hanging off that pointer. And here is the nuance that trips people up. If your metadata is too specific, you shatter your visibility. If your metadata is too generic, you misapply controls and burn your teams. So let's walk both sides. Too specific, you go all in on taxonomy. You invent a subtype for every scenario. RPA bot finance, RPA bot HR, system account batch, system account real time, workload identity lambda, workload identity container, workload identity vendor managed. You get the point. And believe me, with this approach, your dashboards will look incredible. But the problem is you can't easily answer, show me all non interactive identities with standing access to production data. Because that pattern is scattered across 15 different subtypes. Your policies are copy pasted version of each other with tiny unexplained variations. Automation becomes a case statement from hell where every new subtype is another branch to maintain. So the risk isn't reduced, it's just hidden in the metadata of 50 different labels. Now, let's walk the other side, which was too generic. On the other extreme, you say, nope, this is too messy. I heard a podcast once, and we will just have two users and service accounts. Now your IAM engine starts applying human controls, MFA prompts, password rotation, rules, help desk flows to machine identities that are supposed to run unattended at 3 a.m. What happens? Job fails because they can't pass an MFA challenge. People hard code secrets or bypass controls just to keep the lights on. Your team gets branded as the Department of No, and Shadow IAM pops up. So the lesson is not more labels good or fewer labels good or more labels bad or fewer labels bad. The real lesson is your taxonomy should only be as specific as your control plane can genuinely support. Every extra label that doesn't map to a real behavior is basically another line of taxonomic debt. So it's not RPA versus system versus workload. What do we categorize on? Right? I've been talking about the problem for the longest time, which, as we all know, is an easy thing to do. But what's about the solution? So, here is the pivot I want you all to try. Stop anchoring on what the identity claims to be. Start anchoring on how it behaves. Instead of asking, is this a service account or an RPA bot? Ask three much simpler questions. That's it. Is it interactive? Is it ephemeral? Is it privileged? So let's walk through each, but in a very concrete manner. Is it interactive? Interactive identities are one where there is a human behind a keyboard or a device. Someone starts a session, they click around, they type commands. Non interactive identities are used by machines to call machines. API, daemons, agents, batch jobs, workloads. No human is sitting there pressing approve every 30 seconds. The control story should be a night and day different. Interactive, strong, phishing resistant MFA, device posture checks, session controls, maybe continuous risk evaluation. Non interactive, no human MFA, but strict credential lifecycle, scoped tokens, per workload identities, and behavioral monitoring. So your first behavioral split is interactive actor versus non interactive actor. And here is the key rule. If an identity is labeled as non interactive and you ever see it show up in an interactive flow like a web login or a console login or a VPN, that's not, oops, we will fix it later. That's either a policy violation or the beginning of an incident. And you should be asking some hard questions about not just who used it, but also about how did you allow it to be used in that manner. The second is it ephemeral? So this is the second axis, the lifetime. Some identities are supposed to live for years. Employees, hopefully, long-term partners, core infra, and others should have the lifespan lifespan of a Snapchat message. Spin up, do one thing, disappear. If you treat ephemeral identities like long lived ones, you get stale credentials everywhere, zombie permissions, and the huge graveyard of a temporary access that quietly becomes permanent. If you treat long lived identities like ephemeral ones, you drown in noise and break critical stuff. So we define ephemeral actors versus persistent actor. Controls then looks like ephemeral, born with an expiry, created and destroyed by automation, short-lived tokens, rotation as part of natural life cycle. And persistent, which is more stable identifiers with strong lifecycle governance tied to an org change, role change, and offboarding. Now combine the first two axes and you already get something powerful. Interactive plus persistent is classic human user. Interactive plus ephemeral is just in time elevated sessions, break glass access. Non interactive plus persistent, long lived system agents. And non interactive plus ephemeral, modern workload identities in cloud native architecture. And each of these deserves a different control recipe. Now let's look at our third axis, privilege. This is the one where we are the most stuck in old mental models. A lot of organizations still behave as if only human accounts are totally privileged, even though many breaches now leverage overprivileged machine identities and secrets. So ask this: does this identity have standing access to sensitive data or admin functions? And if this thing gets popped, do we suddenly have a really bad day? If yes, it's privileged. I don't care if it is service account or RPA bot or AI agent, the behavior and the blast radius are what matters. Privileged actors, human or machines, should be governed by just-in-time elevation whenever or wherever you can. Strong isolation of credentials and secrets. Enhanced monitoring and anomaly detection, and faster revocation and incident response paths. When you map privilege onto the first two axes, you get eight interesting buckets: interactive, persistent, privileged; interactive, persistent, non privileged; interactive, interactive, ephemeral, privileged; interactive, ephemeral, non privileged. You get the point. These are three combinations, eight categories, right? And now your taxonomy is not about marketing labels. Don't get fooled by the hype. Don't get fooled by the beautification of that slide. Don't get fooled by the nuances, right? Don't get fooled by the vendor slideware. Do what is right for your business. It's about how this identity behaves and how dangerous it is when it misbehaves. And for each of those buckets, you can design a concrete enforceable control plane. So let's connect this back to where identity and access management is headed. We are not going to win this game with a slightly better OU structure or one more level of directory nesting. That era is gone. When non human identities outnumber humans by tens or hundreds to one, you physically cannot govern them at human speed with manual reviews and pretty diagrams. The future looks a lot more like this. You define a few meaningful behavioral categories: interactive versus non interactive, ephemeral versus persistent, privileged versus non privileged. You attach real control recipes to those categories. You wire your telemetry to continuous ask: is this identity behaving like its category says it should? And just a footnote there, I'll keep AI agents out of that because that's an evolving field and I have more thoughts, but I did not wanted to muddy the waters here, so I'm specifically asking you to keep those out of here. But you can absolutely apply this model to them. I'm just saying there is a little bit more nuance when it comes to AI agents. So now, if a supposedly non-interactive identity starts logging into web UIs, that's weird. If an ephemeral identity never expires, that's weird. And if a non-privileged identity suddenly starts doing privileged things, you guessed it, that's weird. And when something is weird, the system doesn't just shrug, it reacts. Step up challenges, revocations, quarantining sessions, paging humans. That's identity as a verb. The labels become hypotheses about behavior, not decorations in the directory. Alright, let's poke one more sacred cow. If you build a level 5 taxonomy on top of a level 2 program, you don't get level 5 security. You get governance debt. What does that actually look like? A level 5 taxonomy is extremely detailed diagrams, lots of categories and subcategories, beautiful architectural docs, and everyone leaves the workshop feeling very smart. A level 2 program is some automation, but lots of manual steps. Inconsistent ownership, partial coverage of apps and clouds, and reviews that happens because audit is coming, not because you want them. When you attach a very advanced, very nuanced taxonomy to a very or a pretty basic implementation, you create fragility. Every new exception becomes a new category. Every new tool or SaaS apps comes with label you try to force fit into your model. And nobody can hold the whole thing in their head, so people start improvising. It's like bolting a Formula One steering wheel onto a Corolla. You don't suddenly go 200 miles an hour, you just make it harder for normal people to drive the car. A healthier approach, design only as many categories as you can back with real enforcement. Forget my access, come up with your own, but you will have to back them with real enforcements. Let your taxonomy grow as your automation and telemetry mature. Be ruthless about retiring categories that turned out to be just labels. Every category is a promise. When you see this label, it means this identity will be governed differently. And if you can't keep that promise, that label is just dead. Right, Monday morning, how do we start untangling this? So, what do you do with all this? Let's make this very practical. If you're listening to this on your commute or your walk, think of this as a little checklist you can try with your team. First, grab a whiteboard or a doc and list out all the identity categories you have today: human, employees, contractors, interns, vendors, etc. Non human, service accounts, workload identities, RPA bots, technical accounts, integration users, whatever your word looks like. For each one, ask a brutally simple question: what are the enforced control differences for this category? If you cannot name at least one real behavior difference, auth, rotation, monitoring, lifecycle, that category is a consolidation candidate. This exercise alone will flush out a surprising amount of governance theater. Next, take either identities directly or your existing categories and tag them along the three axes that we discussed: interactive versus non interactive, ephemeral versus persistent, privileged versus non privileged. Don't overthink on day one. Start with rough rules and refine later. The goal is to build a behavioral map of your landscape that cuts across vendors and legacy labeling. And you will immediately surface weirdness like, wait, why is this service account being used interactively? Or why is this temporary workload identity still around a year later? Or why does this non-privileged account have admin rules? Because these answers are gold. This is where your risk is hiding. Now, for each meaningful combination, like interactive, persistent, privileged, write down what must be true about how you govern it. How is it created? How does it authenticate? How does it get access? And how is that access reviewed? What's monitored by default? What happens when something looks off? Think of these as recipes, not policies. If you picked up this recipe and applied it in Okta, in Entra, in AWS, and in your SaaS applications, it should basically still make sense. That is when you know you are designing for behavior, not for one vendor's idea of an object type. Now, once you have these behavioral recipes, go back to your taxonomy and ask category by category. Does this label map to a distinct recipe or is just a synonym for something we already have? If it is just a synonym, merge it. If it doesn't map to anything real, retire it. Yes, this might or will probably will annoy some people who are emotionally attached to their favorite acronym. I promise you, you will survive and your program will be easier to reason about. Now, last steps, and this is where it gets fun. Start wiring your signals and automations to the behavioral model, not just to the labels in your directory. Use logs, context, and events to infer, is this identity being used interactively or non-interactively? Is it behaving like something ephemeral or something persistent? Is it touching privileged paths or not? Then build responses around deviation. Non-interactive identities, doing interactive stuff, flag it or whatever else you want to do with it. Ephemeral identities that never expires, you got it. Flag it and do whatever you want to do with it. And non-privileged identity, suddenly doing admin access actions, flag it. This is how you climb out of the uncanny valley. You stop worshipping the labels and you start governing the behavior. So let's land this plane. The uncanny valley of identity categorization is that place where our IAM diagrams looks almost perfect, almost human in a way, but the underlying controls just don't line up. We keep adding more types, more subtypes, more OU levels, thinking that if we can just describe reality in enough details, security will magically emerge. But identity in a mature enterprise is not a static noun. It's a living verb, a stream of actions, relationships, and risks over time. If our taxonomies don't translate into distinct enforced behavior, into verbs, then all we have done is create taxonomic debt and really expensive governance theater. The way out isn't another round of renaming accounts, it's shifting our mental model interactive, ephemeral, privileged. And then being brutally honest about what changes in the control plane for each of those. So if you are up for it, here is my challenge to you. Sometime this week, grab your IAM or security teams for 60 minutes. No tools, just a whiteboard or a doc. List your identity categories. Ask which ones actually change behavior. Circle the ones that are just labels. If you walk out of that meeting with even two or three categories to merge or retire, you have already started paying down taxonomic debt. And once you start seeing identity as a verb, you cannot unsee it. You will catch loopholes earlier. You will design better incentives. And your diagram may get a little less pretty, but your security will quietly get a lot stronger. So, thank you for navigating this one with me. Did you notice the wordplay there? Navigator, navigating. If this episode started or sparked ideas, ranty feelings, or oh no, that's us moments, send them my way. You can reach out to me via LinkedIn or you can email me. I love hearing real stories from the trenches from an experts like all of you are. I am Rohit, your identity navigator. And remember, don't fall in love with the label. Follow the behavior. That is where real identity lives.